Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. This is video number 3 in my Raid Fundamentals video series. So this is the video series that I've been putting together, which basically will help you get your Raid journey started on the right foot. If you're new to Raid, we're going to be covering everything that you need to know. So if you missed my first 2 videos, you may want to go back and check those out. The first video was about the base here. It's known as the Bastion. And we talked about every building on this screen. We talked about all of the different icons, the different menus, the different resource counters, everything on this screen that you need to understand. There's a lot going on here. So definitely, if you're new to the game, go check out that video. That's the first one. The second video was about champions. We talked about the champions. We talked about statistics. We talked about skills and masteries. We talked about where you can get your champions, how you level them up, and even some third-party resources, some websites where you can go and find out if your champions are any good and maybe get suggestions for build. So if you're at that part of the game where you're starting to get into your champions, that's a good video to go check out. Today, in this video, we're going to continue with the champion theme. We're going to push that a little bit further, and we're going to start to talk about champion roles, buffs, debuffs, and specific skills that you need to flesh out your squad. Now, this is a squad builder, so whenever you go into a battle, let's say we go into a dungeon, we'll go in here to the dragon lair, and you can see we've got a 5 champion team here, a squad, whatever you want to call it. I usually use the word team. And so we need to build this team effectively for the battle that we're going into. And that requires that we know what roles each of our champions plays, and then we select those roles for the combat that we're trying to win. Okay, so today, that's what we're going to get into. So let me go over and jump to this website. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is buffs and debuffs. Now, buffs and debuffs are a little bit dense, I guess I would say. There are a lot of buffs and debuffs in this game, and you need to know what they all do. And there really are a lot. And it's actually difficult, especially in game, to find buffs and debuffs descriptions. So there is a website. It's actually in the Raid support page where there is a list of buffs and debuffs. You can see it right here. I will include this link in the description of the video. So if you want to come to this page and read up on all the buffs and debuffs and all their effects, I highly recommend you do so, and you can come and find it here. You also have the option, if you don't want to come to this particular website, Hellhades.com does have their own version of the buffs, debuffs, and instant effects list. So you can go through that and you can read that there. And if you're visiting this site based on what we talked about in the second fundamentals video, then you'll already be familiar with the site and you can just come here and find the buffs and debuffs. Okay, now let's talk about champion roles. Okay, so champion roles and buffs, debuffs, instant effects, those all kind of commingle. They all work with each other. So let's go ahead and look at sort of the distribution of team jobs. So whatever team you're putting together, whatever squad you're putting together, you're going to need several roles or several jobs that get done. I should make a distinction between jobs and roles. Okay, a role is what your particular champion does. A job is just something that needs to be done for the entire team. So there may be multiple people who are contributing to a job. Okay, and they're basically 3 jobs that any team needs to do. The first is we need to do damage. We need to do damage to our enemy. So the goal here for any people who are doing the damage job is to end the fight. And this would include DPSers. So by the way, if you're not familiar with the term DPS, it comes from the phrase damage per second. And basically it's just a word that is used to describe either any champion that does damage or the amount of damage that they're doing. So you might say something like, this champion has high DPS, just means they hit hard. Okay. So we have the DPSs, the damage dealers, and then we have the buffers and debuffers. And these are the specifically the buffers and debuffers that increase outgoing damage. So not all buffers and debuffers will do that, but anybody who's increasing outgoing damage is contributing to the damage job of the team. The second team is the team that's keeping you alive. The second job is the group that is keeping the team alive. right? And so that's support and sustain. Support is the most common term that you hear, and this comes from other games. I actually like the term sustain the most because that's what you're doing. You're sustaining the life of your team, or you're sustaining the fight. You're keeping the fight going. So your job really here is to extend the fight. So it's interesting because the damage group is trying to end the fight as quickly as possible, and the support group is trying to give you as much time to win the fight as possible. So even though they're working in conjunction, they're sort of coming at the fight from different ends, right? If you have a lot of damage, the fight may be over instantly. But if you don't have a lot of damage, you may just need to survive for a long time, and then you can sort of outlast the enemy. And most teams are going to need a little bit of both. Finally, the third job of every team is to provide utility. And basically, this is to control the fight, to manipulate all of the other factors besides damage and basically healing to determine the tactical lay of the land. You're going to basically manipulate all of the factors of the fight to create an advantageous scenario where you can either end the fight quickly or extend the fight, or at least prevent the enemy from doing what they're attempting to do. Okay, so those are the three team jobs. Now, when it comes to doing those jobs, so the first job here is damage. Now we have our actual roles, okay? And these are usually the way we refer to champions in the game. So we refer to damage dealers as DPS, or sometimes damage dealers, sometimes nukers, poisoners, burners, bombers. But generally we just say damage dealers or DPS. So if you're doing burst damage, and this is usually just a skill, like you just hit for 1,000 damage or whatever, that is a nuker's job. So we call those people nukers. Usually the damage is very high. It's not sustained over time. It's usually just a burst, and then there may be some downtime before another burst comes. There are sustained damage dealers, and their burst tends to not be as high, but over time they may even do more damage. And so that is something that you have to determine. What kind of damage do you need? Do you need real bursty damage where you're trying to like wipe out a team, like an arena where like you end the fight and it's over? Or maybe you have a boss fight, like clan boss fight, where you need a lot of damage over time. So the second type of damage is what we call damage over time, or dots. And in Raid Shadow Legends, dots require accuracy. Anytime you are affecting the enemy, you need accuracy. The enemy will resist your effects that you apply to them based on their resistance, and your accuracy can overcome their resistance. So the higher your accuracy, the more likely you are to land your damaging debuffs. Those damaging debuffs are poison, HP burns, and bombs. Now, poisons and HP burns are basically just damage over time, which means every time the enemy takes a turn, they get hit for some damage. They work a little bit differently. And again, you can go to that list of debuffs to get more information on poisons and HP burns, because they do work differently. But generally, they do damage based on the health of the enemy. So the higher the health, the more damage they do. So bombs, I'm going to include here as a dot, even though technically it's more of a burst damage kind of scenario. A bomb is a debuff that gets placed, and then it's on a timer. And when the timer gets to 0, it explodes for a lot of damage. So it's somewhere in between burst damage and dots, because it does take some time to happen, and it happens on the enemy's turn rather than on your turn. But it does a lot of damage, and it ignores defense, which means it can be very bursty. The second type of champion that gets involved in doing the damage job of the team is a buffer. You might not normally think of a buffer as a damage dealer. Every champion will hit for a little bit of damage, but buffers often aren't designed to do burst damage or to do dots or whatever, the main damage source of your team is. They are not the main damage source. They are a completely support-based champion, but we don't put them in the support role because the support here is designed to increase the output of damage of your team. So these buffers will add these buffs to the teammates. Increase attack, increase defense. The reason increased defense sometimes increases your damage is because some champions do damage based on their defense stat. So an increased defense for a defensive-based champion would improve their damage. So it's a damage buff. Increased crit damage or increased crit rate. Increased crit damage tends to be a little bit more important than increased crit rate because a lot of times you're already building your champions with 100% crit rate. However, if you have a good increased crit rate champion, then you may not need to build your champions to 100% crit rate because you can get that buff that gets them to 100%. So this is usually a 30% crit rate buff. So you can build your champions with 70% crit rate. And now you can shift those stats into other damaging stats like crit damage or attack or defense, whatever your damage is based on. You can also put up a counterattack buff, which is nice because then anytime you get hit, you will automatically return fire. And that basically just improves how many opportunities you get or increases how many opportunities you get to do damage. So you're going to do more damage. And then you can also have a reflect damage buff, which literally just returns some of the damage that you get hit by. So 30% of the damage that you take, the enemy also takes. The third role is the debuffer. Now, the debuffer can also increase damage, but debuffers affect the enemies. And the difference between buffing your team and debuffing the enemy team is that in order to debuff the enemies, you have to have enough accuracy. So we've already talked about that with the dots. So remember, you kind of have champions who do damage without needing accuracy, and then champions who will do damage by needing accuracy. So when we get down here to the debuffers, that remains true. To place a debuff requires accuracy. But these debuffs can increase your team's damage output. So when you debuff the enemy and you decrease their defense, they take more damage. Weaken is also a damage buff or debuff. Basically what that means is they take 25% more damage. I think it's 15% or 25% depending on the level of the debuff. That's a good thing that we should mention here. Most buffs and debuffs have 2 levels, and if you go back to that website, you will see there is like, a 15% weaken and a 25% weaken. There is a 25% increase attack and a 50% increase attack. So that's something just to know about buffs and debuffs. Okay, so here weaken just increases the amount of damage by a flat percentage that the enemy takes. Poison sensitivity increases the damage that poisons do when they tick. A hex debuff is an interesting debuff because basically what that does is it turns your single target damage into AoE damage. So if you hit an enemy, any other enemy that is under a hex debuff will take a percentage of that damage. It's a low percentage, but it's a way to spread the damage out. Heal reduction, obviously, heal reduction might not seem like a damage ability, but if the enemy is able to heal, then that's going to extend the fight. And the job of damage dealers is to end the fight. So I think of heal reduction as a way to speed up your damage, right? It definitely speeds up the fight. It ends the fight faster if you have an enemy who has any healing. If you don't have an enemy who heals, then heal reduction is useless. But when you have an enemy who heals, heal reduction could be a very nice debuff that will help you end the fight faster. And then block revive is very similar. If you have an enemy who's continually reviving or reviving other allies, then having a block revive prevents that revive from happening and will shorten the fight. Block revive is not a debuff. It's actually an instant effect, or it's a passive effect. But I think of it as a debuff because even though it doesn't require accuracy to land, it's basically weakening the enemies. And so that's something that you want to consider as well. All right, now let's move on to the next job. So the next job is to support and sustain your team. And the first most common type of support that we think of are healers, right? So healers and revivers are that first support type of champion. Now there are 2 jobs there that we're talking about. One is healing, one is reviving. So the first one, just typically you get instant heals in this game. That is the most common form of heal. It can happen based on a passive or can happen based on an active skill that you have to take on your turn. But either way, it's just going to return a chunk of health to anybody who's damaged. There is also a buff, which is a continuous heal. And a continuous heal is sort of like a poison, but for your team, where instead of taking damage when the enemy goes, this heals you when your team goes. So anytime somebody with a continuous heal buff takes a turn, they get a percentage of their health return. And that buff can be over several turns. It could be 1 turn, 2 turn, 3 turns, or more. Okay. A reviver typically will have an instant revive. And so anybody who's dead just gets revived when they use an active skill. However, it's also possible to use a revive on death buff. Now, that means that if you have this buff up on a champion, when that champion dies, that champion will be brought back to life instantaneously. So it's a type of revive, but you have to plan ahead, because if you have the buff up and then it falls off and then the enemy kills you, then you're just dead. So the buff has to be on the champion when the champion dies in order to come back. And finally, I included here remove debuffs, which is what we typically refer to as a cleanse, but the technical language is remove debuffs. Remove debuffs is not really a heal. It's not really a revive. It's not really a buff. So I didn't know exactly where to put it, but it just feels like it falls under the healers and revivers skills. I probably should have put it up with healers, but basically any debuffs that the enemy puts on you, if you remove them, that's going to sustain you, right? Those debuffs are meant to either weaken your ability to fight or to increase your likelihood of dying. So by removing those debuffs, you're keeping your team alive and hopefully, ending the fight sooner as well. Buffers, specifically in the support sustain job, they do a lot of things. There's a lot of different ways to buff, kind of like a healer. So there is definitely overlap between these different roles. So when you think about the big title, the big job, which is support sustain, you can kind of think of that big job as healing or keeping you alive. So sometimes, when you have a buffer and that buffer provides no heals, you don't think of them as a healer. But a buffer can often be even stronger than a healer depending on what they provide you. So the first one is shields. When you get a shield in Raid Shadow Legends, that's basically gray health that gets put on top of the amount of health that you have, and that health has to be removed by the enemy first. Now, a shield is a buff, so it has a duration, so it can fall off naturally when the duration ends. However, while it's up, the enemy has to hit your shields first, unless they have a skill that ignores shields. There are a few champions that can do that, but for the most part, your shield is just like extra health, and so that's kind of like a heal. The other buffs that you have are just buffs that will generally remove or reduce the damage that is incoming. So the first one's increased defense. That works for every single champion in the game. If you increase a champion's defense, they're going to take less damage from any kind of hits. There are champions that ignore defense, but in general, increasing defense makes you more survivable. Strengthen is the flip side of weaken. It's the opposite side of that coin. So weaken makes your enemy take more damage. Strengthen makes your team take less damage. So strengthen just makes you tougher, and it's a kind of damage resistance. Veil and Perfect Veil are kind of interesting buffs. So this is sort of a stealth mechanic. So Veil and Perfect Veil have two effects. The first effect is that it sort of removes you from visual contact with the enemy. They can't see you, and if they can't see you, they can't target you specifically. You can still get hit by AoE skill. So a champion under Veil can be damaged, but it can't be targeted. Perfect Veil is just sort of a higher level of Veil. And the difference between those two is that you get a damage reduction from Veil and Perfect Veil. It's 7.5% from Veil, 15% from Perfect Veil. So even if you are damaged by, let's say, an AoE, you're still going to take less damage if you're under Veil or Perfect Veil. Then we get to the really big buffs, which are block damage and unkillable. Block damage literally just stops any damage that's coming in, so that's a great buff. Again, there are champions that can ignore block damage, but for the most part, the vast majority of champions, you just stop their damage. Unkillable works a little bit differently. Unkillable allows you to take damage, but when you get to 0 health or 1 health, you don't die. And you will stay alive for as long as that unkillable buff remains on you. And of course, you can heal back up. So you could heal back up to full and then get another unkillable buff later and just become really hard to kill that. Block debuffs is basically what it says. It prevents debuffs from coming in. So if the enemy is trying to weaken you or lower your defense, but you're blocking that, then you are more likely to survive. Okay, and then the following one, the last one is increase resistance. Increase resistance works kind of like block debuffs, but only through your resistance. So block debuffs, it doesn't matter what your resistance is, you just block all incoming debuffs. Resistance is your natural resistance to debuffs. So if you increase that resistance, you're more likely to prevent a debuff from occurring. This stat, resistance, works in conjunction with accuracy. So if the enemy's accuracy is higher than your resistance, but just a little bit higher than your resistance, and you can increase your resistance in the middle of a fight, you now overcome their accuracy and they're going to be unable to apply their debuffs. All right. And then the support sustain role, there are also debuffers who can actually extend your fight. Now, again, debuffers affect enemies, so that requires accuracy, whereas buffers don't require accuracy. So the first and easiest way to sustain your team, to like increase your survivability, is to decrease the enemy's attack. Most enemies are going to do damage based on their attack. You can also decrease defense here against a defensive-based damager, but I didn't list that here. So decrease attack or decrease defense would be a good debuff to reduce incoming damage. You can also decrease crit rate or decrease crit damage. Those are more rare, but they can be useful. Another debuff that actually works great for sustaining your team is Leech. Leech is a really unusual debuff because it works strangely. It kind of works like a buff for your team, but it does require accuracy. So basically, it's like a vampiric buff or debuff that you put on the enemy. So when you hit the enemy that has Leech, you return some of the damage as health. And this can help sustain your team. Decreased accuracy is kind of the equivalent of increased resistance, right? So the buffers increase your team's resistance. The debuffers can decrease the enemy team's accuracy. And by decreasing their accuracy, it's going to make it harder for them to place debuffs on you. Decreased resistance is decreasing the enemy's resistance. I wasn't sure exactly where to put decreased resistance because it does help to debuff the enemy both when you're trying to sustain and when you're trying to do damage. So decreased resistance can actually also help your damage dealers. But basically, by decreasing the enemy's resistance, it makes it easier for you to place any other debuffs. Typically, the way this works is either you need a decreased resistance that cannot be resisted, meaning accuracy doesn't apply, and then the other debuffs have a lower threshold, or you have one champion with really high accuracy, put the decrease resist on, and then your champions with slightly lower accuracy can get their debuffs away as well. And finally, there is an instant. And again, I put this with the debuffers, even though it's not a debuff. This is an instant ability, which is increase debuff duration. So imagine you've already applied a bunch of debuffs to an enemy, but you want to keep those up for longer. You can increase the debuff duration with certain champions. And that actually doesn't require any accuracy, even though I put it in this list. It does not require accuracy to increase debuff duration because you're affecting the debuffs, not the champion. So technically, it doesn't need accuracy. All right, so let's talk about the roles for this job. So the first one is crowd control, and this does require accuracy because crowd control typically happens through debuffing. So the most common crowd controls, actually, I think we have all of the crowd controls here. So our stun, freeze, petrification, sleep, fear, true fear, provoke, and taunt. Now, stun is probably the best crowd control because what happens is when you apply this debuff, the enemy can't take their turn. And in fact, they lose their turn, meaning that like their cooldowns don't regenerate during a stun. Freeze is like a stun, but it's a little bit weaker because of two reasons. One is the enemy gets their cooldowns to reduce as they miss their turn. They're still going to miss their turn, but their cooldown will reduce. However, because they're frozen, they take 15% less damage from attacks. Petrification is interesting. It's really, really rare. Petrification basically prevents turn meter increases and buffs. So there, not only do you lose the turn, or not only does the enemy lose their turn, but they can't get buffed and they can't get their turn meter increased. We have sleep. Sleep is probably the weakest of all of the CCs. Basically, sleep would prevent an enemy from taking their turn. However, if the enemy gets damaged while they have a sleep debuff on them, they get woken up and then they can take their turn as normal. So it's a bit tricky to use sleep. Fear and True Fear is also a weaker version of a crowd control. Basically, a fear has a 50% chance of making the enemy skip their turn. For fear, if they miss their turn, if they try to use a skill and miss their turn, that skill will not go on cooldown. For True Fear, if they try to use a skill and miss the skill because of the 50%, their skill will go on cooldown. Provoke is a pretty strong crowd control. Basically, when you put a debuff out there, a provoke debuff out there, whatever champion put that provoke debuff out there must be attacked by every provoked champion. Okay, so the enemy gets the debuff, and the enemy has to attack the ally who put that debuff, that provoke debuff on them. However, they can only use their A1, so they can only use their basic attack, basically, and so it prevents enemies from using their more powerful skills, but it doesn't stop them from actually doing their turn. They still take their turn. Okay. And then taunt, even though I talk about taunt as a crowd control because it does not require accuracy, but a taunt is like a provoke, but in reverse. It is a buff. So it is an ally who gets a buff, and then all enemies, every single enemy that can be provoked or taunted, must attack that champion. Okay. Speed and turn meter control. This is a really important role, and it's actually extremely important in Raid Shadow Legends, more than maybe any other role. This is the role that's going to determine the way your team composition works. So the first is speed. Now, speed is simple. Speed is like initiative. So the higher the speed, the more likely you are to go first. And you can lap. If there's a multiple turn fight, you can lap the enemy. So if you're going twice as fast as somebody, you'll go twice before they go once. So you do have speed manipulators. Now, that doesn't require an accuracy. If you just put a speed buff on yourself, that's great. So speed buff goes on a team for 1 or 2 turns or 3 turns, and it just increases the speed that everybody is moving at. You can also increase turn meter. This doesn't increase the speed, but it literally just pushes your progress towards taking a turn up the line. So imagine that you have 5 champions and the enemy has 5 champions. There is a line, there's a queue of 10 champions. And basically, turn meter allows your champions to skip ahead in line and get in front of the enemy. So a speed buff makes you move faster over multiple turns, whereas an increase in turn meter basically teleports you to the front of the line. You can also affect the speed and turn meter of the enemy. These require accuracy like any ability that affects the enemy other than just straight damage. So you can place a decrease speed debuff on the enemy, which will slow them down. You can also decrease their turn meter, which is literally like sending somebody to the back of the line. So you just push them back. You're like, hey, go back 3 spots. Okay. So speed and turn meter determine who goes first. And going first is incredibly powerful in Raid Shadow Legends. It also determines who goes more often. So getting more turns than your enemy is also very powerful. All right. And the final bit of utility and control is skill manipulation. Now, this term is a little bit loose. It covers a variety of abilities, but I'm going to kind of walk you through it pretty quickly, and you'll see what I mean when we talk about skill manipulation. So again, these are the abilities that require no accuracy. So you can reduce the cooldowns of yourself or your allies. So like, when I say yourself, one champion can reduce its own cooldowns, or it can reduce the cooldowns of its allies. So cooldown reduction just allows you to get more skills out more quickly. There is even a gear set that can reduce cooldown reduction. So cooldown reduction can be really powerful because one of the checks and balances on champion power is how fast they do their ability. And so this basically speeds up your ability usage. The second skill manipulation here is to extend buff duration. So if a buffer puts good buffs on your team, those have a duration and they will come off over time. typically with cooldowns, the cooldown is longer than the buff duration. So you'll have a buff that goes up for 2 turns, but the cooldown will be for 3 turns. But if you have another champion that extends that buff duration, you can extend it by 1 turn, say. Now that buff goes up for 2 turns, then that gets extended to 3 turns, and then it's on a 3-turn cooldown, which means that the buff duration and the cooldown are the same, so you will have that buff up 100% of the time. So extending a buff duration can be an extremely powerful skill, especially in certain places like the Demon Lord clan boss. Okay, the final type of skill manipulation that these do require accuracy because you're affecting the enemy is you can block active skills, that's a debuff. You can block passive skills, that's also a debuff, or you can increase cooldowns. That typically is not a debuff, that's just an instant effect. But all of them require accuracy, whether it's a debuff or instant effect that affects the enemy. So block active skills is probably the most powerful of all of these, and it's also the most common. Your A1, your A2, your A3, all of these can get locked out, and it is a debuff. So that debuff can be removed by an ally who doesn't have block active skills on them. So if you have somebody with high resistance, you can potentially cleanse off this debuff, but it will prevent any active skills from being used other than the A1. So it works kind of like a provoke. Block active skills makes the enemy just be able to use their A1. Block passive skills is more rare, and it can be very powerful in specific situations, but it is also a debuff that basically prevents a passive skill from happening. Passive skills typically happen with the champion's turn. It just automatically happens. You don't have to do anything for it to happen. So this would prevent that from happening. I'll give you an example. Syl of the Drakes heals allies by 10% at the beginning of her turn. This is just a passive that happens every time she takes a turn. If she had a block passive skills debuff on her, she would not heal her ally. Increased cooldowns is the last effect, and like I said, that's not a debuff, although it does require accuracy. There are only a few champions that actually have this ability, and you can either increase the cooldown sort of randomly, or you could increase it by a set number of turns, 1 turn or 2 turns, or you could put it on cooldown entirely. So for instance, you might have an ability that randomly puts one enemy's skill on cooldown. So if that's a 4-turn cooldown, it'll be on the maximum cooldown. So that is a very powerful skill, but like I said, it's rare and it can be hard to control with some champions. So finding a champion where they will, let's say, lock out all of the cooldowns of the enemies for the full duration, that would be extremely rare and extremely powerful. Okay, so I know that was a lot to take in. And there are a lot of buffs and debuffs in this game. And along with the other instant skills that are happening, you need to mix all of those roles together with your damage dealers to create a well-balanced team in order to conquer the fights that you're choosing to take on. So you will design different teams for different tasks. So I'm going to take you back to that dragon team that I showed you before, Dragon's Lair. And we'll actually go to stage 25 here. And so if we're looking at this team, I have several champions here. You don't need to have these champions, but you need to fill these roles. So the first thing that we have here is we have a champion who has a speed aura. So increases speed in all battles by 19%. So that helps our speed game. I don't have any other turn manipulation here. So I don't actually have a turn meter increaser or a speed buff. I just have the speed aura that's going to get us moving kind of quickly. Okay. And then I have 3 sustain champions and 2 damage champions. And the sustain happens with some utility, but primarily these are just healers and damage dealers. So I have an HP burner, so she has to apply a debuff, HP burn. I have a bomber who applies bombs, and those bombs then turn into poisons. So I'm doing all of the dots. I'm doing HP burn, poison, and bombs. And then I also have some utility coming out of my lead here who does an ally attack. When this champion does their skill, the whole team attacks simultaneously. They also get a crit rate buff and a crit damage buff, so they're going to do extra damage. This champion also heals. This champion here, Syl of the Drakes, heals. And then this champion over here, which is Mithrala, provides shields, strengthens, and increased defenses. So we're going to get a little bit of everything here, and I'm going to show you how this fight works, and that'll be enough for you to see a good team comp in action. Okay, so we're doing it on auto. So first of all, a lot is happening, but you can see I put out a lot of debuffs, including a hex debuff. This sort of circle with the triangle inside of it, that's a hex debuff. So we know that that spreads damage. This symbol here, the little bubbling beaker, I guess that's actually a bomb. And then the little skull inside the bottle, that's a poison. This boot here in red, all of the red symbols are debuffs. So this boot here in red is a slow. So I am reducing the speed of the enemy. And then over here, there's a circle and a flame. That's actually a debuff that comes from a blessing, and it's called Smite. I think it's called Smite. And so it does a bunch of damage as well. And then you can see all the buffs that I have on my champions. I'm going to just let them go ahead and run through. And what you're going to see is we're doing a lot of damage. So I don't need a lot of crowd control because we're just going to kind of burn through the enemy. I do have some healing and some shielding. So that's going to prevent me from dying. So I don't have to worry about revives, and I don't have to worry about crowd controls. Alternately, I could crowd control this enemy. I did get a stun out there because I do have one champion who throws a low percentage chance of a stun. That's Sill of the Drakes. I think it's a 30% chance. So she can get some stuns. But basically, we're just doing so much damage and moving so fast that we're taking multiple turns to the enemy's turns. And this allows us to extend fights. You can see these enemies have lots of health. I'm actually doing quite a bit of damage. It's not an overwhelming amount of damage. There are certainly content creators out there who have champions you'll see that do way, way more damage than what I'm doing. So this isn't exactly a fast run, but it is a reliable run. And when I'm farming dungeons, level 20 through 25, I just want to make sure I'm getting 100% of my value for my energy. So this will probably take somewhere in the 3 to 3.5 minute range, I think. But as you can see, the enemies don't really get turns. I just keep going. So I don't even need crowd control. I don't need freezes or stuns or sleeps or anything like that. I can just go faster than the enemy is going. All right, now we get to the big bad boss. You can see I've got poisons up there. I've now got an HP burn up there. That's a weaken. You can see the debuffs are increasing. Now I've got bombs. Now I've got a decrease attack. Now I've got a hex. Now I've got another bomb. I've got a smite. Actually, that might be brimstone. I forget it's brimstone, but you put a smite debuff on, something like that. Anyway, if it has a yellow outline, if the debuff has a yellow outline, that means it's protected and can't be removed. So a cleanse would not remove that debuff. And as you can see, I am very buffed up. My team is very strong. Their health is good. And the enemy is basically doing nothing to me. So this is a good team composition for this particular fight. It's highly reliable. It does the damage that it needs to do to clear the waves. It does the damage it needs to do to kill the boss. It keeps me alive. I do have a cleanse. We might see the cleanse. There's the cleanse, removes all the debuffs. I've got the shields up. I'm getting health back. So a little bit of everything. And that makes this team very reliable. And we should defeat this dragon. Taking a little bit longer than I'd like, but 100% chance to kill this dragon. And I get my 6-star boots here, which are no good, so I'll sell them. Now I'll show you one other team very quickly. The next video that I'm going to do is about speed tuning in the arena. So I'm just going to preview that so that you can see the way an arena team works, kind of with the composition that we're talking about, or the roles that we're talking about. So I'm going to jump into this fight, and this is my arena team right now. I have Arbiter, who has a speed in arena battle aura of 30%, so I'm going to go first. I'm going to try to beat this team to the punch. She also increases turn meter, and she gives increased attack. Then I have my Cardiel. That was the same champion I was using as a lead in my dragon fight. He's got that ally attack, so I'm going to be able to kill the ultimate Death Knight here, who is sort of the tank of the enemy team. And then I've got another turn meter manipulator who's also going to drop defense of the enemy, so it's going to make them take more damage and give me more of a turn boost. And then I've got my Gembo, who is my nuker, who is just going to AoE the whole team. So I'm going to put this on manual so that you can see the way that this team comp works. And again, you can see the roles that I have here. I have a utility champion. I have 2 utility champions. Actually, I would say I have 3 utility champions here to get going very quickly and to increase my damage output. I don't really need a reviver, although I have one here. I don't have any shields. I don't have any crowd control. I don't have any buffs really for myself that are not offensive in nature. So yeah, so the first thing I'm going to do is increase my turn meter and get my offensive buff. So now I'm going to hit harder. Then I'm going to decrease the enemy turn meter. Then I'm going to drop defense of the enemies. You can see that wasn't 100%, but I got 1 out there at least. That interaction with Ultimate Death Knight is a little bit tricky. That's based on a counterattack that happened probably from either a mastery or some gear that you can get that gives you a counterattack. Okay, so now I have my nuker. He's going to increase his crit rate and crit damage, and then he's going to hit the whole team. Their enemy, I did not kill this last enemy, and that happened to be the Reviver. So the Reviver is built as tanky as possible to give the team exactly the opportunity that just happened. That if he's the only one alive, he can bring the entire team back. The good news is I'm faster. So even though he revived everybody, my whole team's going to get to go before he gets to go. So now we have to re-kill Ultimate Death Knight. All right, here I'm going to put a block debuffs up and a revive on death because they actually are going to get a turn. Let's kill one of the nukers. Turn meter, drop defense, kill one of the nukers, kill the reviver, game over. Again, you can see every team has a specific design. You don't just throw 4 good champions together and hope they work right. You have to speed tune them, which means get them to go in the correct order, and you have to use the correct skills in the correct order to get the optimal performance out of that team. And you have to make sure that the roles are distributed enough that you can handle the scenario that you're dealing with. In this case, in Arena, I basically just need to kill that team. I don't have to fight 10 rounds or 15 rounds or 20 rounds the way I had to fight in the Dragon. I don't have to clear multiple waves before I get to the boss the way I did in the Dragon. So that team was built very differently than this team, but both teams were intentionally constructed for the fight that they're in. Okay, so if you want to see more on team construction and speed tuning, be sure to check out my next video in the series, in my Raid Fundamentals series, which will be on speed and speed tuning. That's a very important video, so definitely don't miss that. If you have any questions about anything I covered today, please be sure to put those in the comments below. I will try to get to them as soon as I can. I am going on holiday for 2 weeks, but I will be checking in remotely to make sure that I get back to anybody's comment. That's it for this video. I know it was a long one, and I appreciate your patience getting all the way here to the end. These concepts are really important. You're going to find them valuable in your raid journey. So definitely go back and rewatch this video if you need to. I will be covering buffs and debuffs again in a future video. I will also be covering team compositions in my next video, speed tuning and team compositions in my next video for specific fights. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out. If you want, go ahead and subscribe now so that you get notifications when that video comes out. Thanks for hanging out. I've been Colred. I'll see you in another video soon.